The first impossible fact was this. The grain silos were breathing. I logged it in the pre-landing vox, calm as catechism, and felt the bridge crew on the Carmine Edict go very still in their harnesses. Verdania Prime rotated below us like a fat green reliquary, clouds banded in milk and ash, irrigation seas glistening with the sickly sheen of a half-forgotten blessing. 6 notes pulsed on every open frequency, too clean to be storm interference, too sweet to be anything the Mechanicus would admit to writing. The hexachord repeated every 66 seconds, an exact rhythm you could set your heart to if you wanted to die easy. The Navy Master-at-Arms asked if the litanies of silence would be applied planet-wide. I told him no. I told him we had 6 hours to keep his lances cold. We dropped through the cloud floor in a thunder of re-entry prayer, turbulence stacking up against the Valkyrie's frame like the knuckles of a penitent beating a door. The vox was wet with static. I could taste copper in the air feed. Preacher Argan's voice was a sanded rasp, the words of the Catechism of Abstinence clipped to bare bones. No flourish to feed on. We deny. We mute. We unmake desire. On my left, Magos Biologis Heliox 7 rattled a soft string of Binharik that smelled, to me alone, of rosewater and hot iron. Across from me, Tempesta Prime Cade checked the seals on his scions one by one, gauntleted fingers tapping out a 6 count on carapace plates, as if he too had been caught by the rhythm. Lowe, youngest of the squad, tried to hide a tremor in his thumbnail when the hexachord brushed the hull again and set teeth singing. I have seen men go to their knees sobbing under artillery that broke the horizon. It is a quieter thing to see a room go rigid, because 6 notes ring sweet in the bones. Telemetry crawled over the inside of my visor, pressure stable, humidity rising, external temperature 31 imperial degrees and climbing, an anomalous CO2 spike, like a congregation breathing in before the Amen. Carmine Edict pinged our drop capsule. Exterminatus authorization prepared. Revised window contingent upon ground assessment. I keyed the return with my sigil and a short-cast benediction, a bureaucratic hand laid on the shoulder of a man about to pull a lever he would see in his sleep. Then we were down. Verdania Prime's primary agricultural complex rose from the plain in tiers of functional ugliness that had been slowly embraced by creeping repair. The outer hull should have been cold plasteel. It looked instead like a cathedral ribcage that had been buried and then grew to meet the sun. Arches and buttresses softened under a film that caught the light like the inside of a mouth. Wheat should have hissed dry under the wash of the Valkyrie's turbines. It sighed. The silos lifted and fell with a long, slow inhale that left the air damp. My auspex chirped an organic signature across an entire square kilometre, and then crashed the display in a polite blink of nothing, as if embarrassed to have called a world alive. We disembarked in staggered wedge formation over a field that squelched, each bootprint filled not with water, but with a thin, clear serum that smelled of honey and old pennies. Argan swung his censer. The smoke hung too long and drifted against the wind to coil around the silo doors and make them glisten. I raised a hand, dropped it to a fist, and we moved low, tight, disciplined. The breathing grew louder as we approached, a draft that tugged hair at the nape beneath seals, a warmth that found seams and pressed there. Lowe's breath fogged his visor on the inside. He scrubbed it with the back of his glove and hissed the kind of apology men make to their own equipment. The main access hatch to Silo 12 should have been simple. Cog tooth lock, double right, machine spirit pacified by a careful hand. It sat instead like a lip trembling with withheld laughter. The keywell pulsed. Heliox extended a mechadendrite, and it recoiled, as if offended by the taste of honest metal. He inclined his head the smallest fraction, priest to priest, and began the opening ordinances in a measured monotone that did not invite participation. In the visor glow, I watched his subdermal glyphs brighten in sequence along the arc of his clavicle, and knew he felt the same pressure I did along the spine. An invitation to hum, to be useful, to be part of whatever had decided to breathe. The hexacord rolled through the soil and set one of the armored plating bolts vibrating. It danced a clean circle against the hatch and then lay still. I logged it. Anomalous sympathetic resonance across composite steel and living tissue. No, I didn't say living tissue. Not aloud. The Ordo has words for what we see and words for what we admit we have seen. Preacher Argon finished his first verse and went into the second, voice thinner now, sweat beading under his eyes and tracking down the crook of his nose where the respirator bit into flesh. Comms clicked and chimed. Every 66 seconds, the ship above us sent the same cold inquiry. Status, status, status. Every 66 seconds, I sent my reply, investigating. The rhythm tried to nest in that space between ask and answer and make a song of it. Cade coughed, a dry bark that said he would shoot me first if my mouth started to change the melody without orders. He needn't have worried. I have wanted many things in my life. To be admired, to be remembered, to hear my name in a certain voice. It was a relief to want only a clean report and 9 bodies back where 8 had gone down. Heliox finished. The lock sighed open, not with gears, but with a slow dilating wetness that gleamed like drawn breath. The passage beyond was darker than it should have been, like a throat. The air that exhaled past us was sugared and warm. I stepped through first, and the ribbed walls leaned in to listen. The corridor swallowed our light and gave it back wrong, warmer and slower, like honey poured through amber glass. What should have been plasteel decking yielded underfoot, not soft, but resilient. A membrane stretched taut over something that pulsed with our weight and resumed its gentle tension the moment we moved on. Each step drummed against the substrate, and the substrate drummed back, a conversation in percussion that made my sternum itch. The temperature climbed with each dozen paces until sweat pooled in the small spaces where armor met flesh, and the air grew thick enough to taste. Copper and crushed flowers, pollen without blooms, sweetness with an edge that caught in the back of the throat like the first symptom of something terminal. I raised 2 fingers, then 1, pace slow, checks every 6 meters, and Cade passed the signal down the line with the fluid efficiency that separated veterans from meat when worlds went sideways. The hexacord pulsed through the infrastructure every 66 seconds, no longer confined to Vox channels, but bleeding directly through the walls around us, a rhythm that wanted to nest in the hollow spaces behind our eyes. My biomonitor traced the cycle with bureaucratic precision, a small graph blooming and collapsing in perfect time. I did not answer the Carmine Edict's status ping. I did not want to see the word confirmed on my display when I knew that whatever we confirmed here would write itself into the ship's bones and follow us home. The walls were ribbed like the interior of some vast throat, their surfaces beaded with condensation that caught our lamp glow and threw it back in patterns too regular to be coincidence. When Preacher Argon began the next verse of his counter-litany, voice deliberately flat, tuneless, denying melody, the ribs contracted almost imperceptibly, and the moisture gathered into clear, gelatinous buds where his consonants struck the air. The buds sprouted hair-thin filaments that combed toward his mouth as if they had heard something worth repeating. I cut my hand across my chest. Silence. The filaments shivered, collapsed, and slumped back into slickness. We went to hand signals after that, the old soldier's language of knives and numbers and room shapes drawn in humid air. Heliox throttled his Binharic down to bone-deep whispers, light stuttering under his skin like distant lightning. His new spheric dampeners hummed with counter-frequency that made the walls recoil in small, wounded contractions. The Auspex readings crawled across his optical display in neat columns that made no sense. Organic mass at 400% standard, atmospheric pheromone traces that belonged in a hive queen's breeding chamber, temperature climbing toward body heat in a facility that should have been cold as a crypt. Every sweep painted our faces in sickly green, and every sweep confirmed what our eyes already knew. We were walking through the circulatory system of something vast and patient. 20 meters deeper, The passage opened into a junction where corridors met like arteries, feeding a heart. The walls here had given up pretending to be architecture and admitted themselves as anatomy, glistening with the kind of moisture that speaks of circulation and warmth. Veins of bioluminescent fluid pulsed through transparent sections, casting everything in organic light that made our carapace armor look like the shells of deep-sea creatures. The air grew thicker, sweeter, until breathing felt like drowning in perfumed honey. We found the servitor grafted into a grain storage apparatus that had forgotten its original purpose. Its torso had been split and spread like the pages of an illuminated manuscript, copper tubing running from exposed spine to feed lines that disappeared into the breathing walls. The skull had been opened with surgical precision to accommodate 6 polished tuning pegs that leaked thin, musical fluid down cheeks of tarnished brass. Each peg trembled on its own axis, singing notes too high for human ears, but perfectly pitched to make teeth ache at the root. The servitor's eyes moved with mechanical precision, tracking our approach, but its mouth worked soundlessly around words in corrupted Binharic that tasted of salt and roses when they touched the air. Heliox extended a data probe toward the neural interface, and the walls contracted sharply around us like a throat swallowing. The hexachord swelled, no longer background static but foreground symphony, and I felt it in my molars, in the spaces between vertebrae where nerve met bone. The servitor's mouth opened in a perfect O of mechanical rapture and spoke in a voice that was half sacred cant and half something else, something that made the walls weep with anticipation. The words were technical readout: storage capacity, nutrient distribution protocols, maintenance schedules, but underneath ran a melody that invited participation, a rhythm that wanted to be hummed. Harvest Vault 6, it sang in Binharic lullaby, the phrase repeating like a prayer worn smooth by constant use. Harvest Vault 6. Harvest Vault 6. Cade positioned his signs in Overwatch, Hellguns trained on passages that branched away into darkness, that seemed to breathe on its own. The complex was larger than the architectural plans indicated, or perhaps it was growing as we moved through it, corridors curving away from expected destinations, like arteries following need rather than design. Laho wiped condensation from his visor for the 3rd time, and I saw his hand shake, the tremor matching the pulse that ran through floor and walls and the spaces between our ribs. The Magos completed his interface and jerked the probe free with a sound like tearing silk. Static crackled through his vocalizer, almost but not quite matching the servitor's tune, and for a moment his optical arrays flickered in perfect synchronization with the creature's dead lenses. He stepped back, mechadendrites coiling close to his body in a gesture I had never seen him make. Protective, almost fearful. The air around the servitor shimmered with heat distortion, and when I looked directly at it, the edges of my vision went soft and sweet. We pressed deeper, following the main arterial passage toward what the schematic insisted was Storage Bay 6. The walls grew more elaborate, simple ribbing giving way to patterns that resembled both Gothic architecture and anatomical diagrams rendered in living tissue. The floor pulsed in steady rhythm, and our biomonitors began to synchronize. First mine, then Cade's, then all of us locked into the same slow heartbeat that drummed up through our boots and into our bones. The noospheric packet loss spiked to exactly 16.6%, a number that felt significant in ways I could not quantify. Then Lowe stumbled, caught himself against the wall, and where his gauntlet touched the surface, the material dimpled and flushed deeper pink. He snatched his hand back with a curse that turned into a cough, and when he opened his mouth to apologize, flower petals drifted out on his breath. Small, delicate things, like tissue paper that dissolved in the humid air before they could reach the floor. He stared at me with wide eyes, and I saw my own face reflected in his visor, distorted and strange. A new sound emerged from somewhere ahead, not the hexachord, but something deeper, more mournful, like a cello made of bone and sinew. A lateral silo aperture that should have been sealed began to dilate slowly, deliberately, like a vast organic iris opening to regard us with interest. Cold air exhaled from the opening, sweeter than anything we had yet encountered, carrying the scent of exotic flora and something else, something ancient and cloying that made saliva pool under the tongue. Our biomonitors, usually displaying individual rhythms in chaotic symphony, suddenly locked into perfect unison, matching the slow, deep exhalation from the dilating passage. It was the sound of something vast drawing breath, and we were standing in its lungs. The aperture dilated wider with deliberate, muscular precision, revealing not the sterile maintenance shaft marked on our schematics, but something altogether more intimate. A vertical passage lined with ribbed tissue that pulsed in slow, rhythmic contractions. Cold air exhaled from its depths, so frigid it burned the exposed skin around my respirator seals, carrying scents that had no place in any imperial facility. Jasmine threaded with copper, sweetness edged with the mineral tang of deep earth and old blood. Our biomonitors, locked in their unnatural synchronization, pulsed in perfect time with the shaft's breathing, a shared rhythm that made my sternum ache with each cycle. I raised 2 fingers, then made a fist, double-line rappel, anchor points, silence protocol. Heliox extended his mechadendrites to probe the slick walls, their adamantine tips seeking purchase in tissue that yielded like cartilage before accepting the bite. Where his iron salt anchors penetrated, the organic substrate hissed and contracted, leaving small, weeping wounds that glowed with faint bioluminescence. Each anchor point pulsed in time with our synchronized heartbeats, tiny stars of pain in the living architecture. The Magos worked with mechanical precision, but I caught the tremor in his optical arrays. Even the machine spirit was learning to be afraid. Preacher Argon fumbled for his pouch of consecrated iron salt, fingers shaking as he began the rites of warding. His breath, heavy with liturgical fog, formed visible prayers in the humid air. High Gothic script that hung suspended like silver calligraphy before dissolving into the general sweetness. Where his exhalations touched the walls, the tissue recoiled in subtle waves, as if the very act of worship caused physical discomfort to whatever had claimed this place. The phenomenon established a new rule in our growing catalogue of impossibilities. Here, prayer was not comfort but weapon, not solace but scalpel. We descended into the breathing dark, our rappel lines singing with controlled tension. The shaft forced our descent into an unnatural rhythm, 6 counts between anchor points, 6 seconds of controlled fall, the undulations of the passage making any other cadence impossible. The walls were layered like anatomical diagrams rendered in living tissue, muscle and sinew woven into patterns that flexed with each slow inhalation. Our helmet lamps were absorbed rather than reflected, giving the descent a velvety, suffocating quality, as if we were falling through dark honey that had learned to breathe. 40 meters down, the shaft opened into vastness that swallowed our light and gave back only suggestions of impossible scale. The cultivation chamber stretched beyond our lumen reach, its ceiling a translucent membrane through which filtered light that was not starlight, viscous, violet radiance that moved like liquid through the air and cast shadows that bent toward us regardless of our position. The floor was divided into hexagonal plots, arranged in mathematical precision that hurt to contemplate. 6 rows of 6 fields, each containing hybrid growths that pulsed with visible circulation, their stalks jointed like fingers, their seed heads heavy with something that resembled teeth beneath translucent enamel. Hair-fine filaments descended from the luminous membrane above, swaying with deliberate purpose. As we moved into the chamber, they turned as one to point directly at me. Not at Cade, not at the squad, but at me specifically, tracking my movement with the attention of 1,000 invisible eyes. The hexachord here was not merely sound but physical presence, a resonance that vibrated through substrate and bone alike, carrying whispers that rode its current like parasites. Hush, the harvest listens. We advanced in tactical formation across substrate that was too warm, too yielding, moulding itself around our boots and releasing them with reluctant suction. the cultivation plots, responded to our presence with increased activity, stalks swaying without wind, root systems pulsing with accelerated circulation that made the floor throb underfoot. Every 66 seconds, the chamber held its breath during the hexachord's peak, and in those moments of suspension, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent, promising things that made the spaces behind my eyes itch with unwanted hunger. Cade raised his fist, and we froze. 50 meters ahead, one of the cultivation pods was budding with something that made recognition crawl up my spine like ice water. The growth was human-sized, human-shaped, developing features that belonged to Tempesta Prime Cade himself. The scar along his left temple, where Mordian shrapnel had kissed him. The slight cant to his nose where it had been broken and improperly set during the Cadian 47th's last stand. The exact pattern of service studs that marked his years of faithful service. The podcade's eyes were closed, lips moving in silent prayer, mouthing words that only the real Cade would know. Private litanies, personal confessions, the secret names he whispered to the Emperor in the dark hours before dawn. Heliox approached with the measured precision of a tech priest conducting sacred analysis, his auspex painting the growth in false color overlays that revealed internal structures too complex for simple plant matter, neural networks branching like lightning, circulatory systems that pulsed with recognizable rhythm, what appeared to be a partially formed digestive tract. The readings cascaded across his optical display in neat columns that made increasingly little sense. Cellular activity at 300% normal, genetic markers matching Imperial Guard personnel files, consciousness indicators fluctuating between dormant and fully aware. The temperature in the chamber rose perceptibly. Sweat pooled in the spaces where my body glove met skin, and the cultivation plots around us responded with visible excitement, stalks lengthening, seed heads turning to follow our movement, the bioluminescent panels brightening until the honey-thick light began to take on colors that had no names, hues that existed somewhere between violet and gold, and made the inside of my skull itch with their intensity. Then the podcade's eyes snapped open, not the glassy stare of vegetative growth, but the alert, intelligent gaze of a soldier assessing tactical situation. It blinked once, twice, and smiled with perfect recognition. Its lips moved, and through our sealed helmets, through atmospheric filters and vox dampeners, and every barrier we had erected between ourselves and this place, we heard it speak in Cade's own voice, with Cade's own inflection, carrying the weight of shared campaigns and mutual trust that no mimicry should have been able to capture. Don't leave me in the dark. The words carried harmonics that made the chamber walls contract around us like a fist closing, and I realized that we were not merely observing some isolated aberration, but standing in the middle of a vast organic network that had been studying us with the same intensity we brought to studying it, and finding us far more interesting than we had found it. The podcade's plea hung in the perfumed air like a blasphemous prayer, and I watched the real Cade's face go rigid behind his visor as recognition crawled up his spine like ice water. His hellgun snapped to firing position with parade ground precision, the muzzle tracking between his own features and the thing that wore them with such perfect, obscene fidelity. The barrel tremor lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Not fear, but the deeper violation of seeing oneself reduced to meat and possibility. Identity stripped down to raw genetic information and rebuilt as temptation. "Cut it down," I ordered, my voice deliberately flat as ritual blade on stone. The words harmonized with the hexachord despite my efforts to keep them tuneless, and the cultivation chamber responded with visible pleasure. Stalks swaying in unison, bioluminescent panels brightening until the honey-thick light began to pulse in rhythm with our synchronized biomonitors. Cade drew his combat blade without lowering the hell gun, movements precise as a surgical procedure. The pod thing watched him approach with lazy interest, blinking with the same measured cadence he used when calculating firing solutions, and its smile never wavered. When the blessed steel bit into the root node at the pod's base, perfumed ichor burst in a hot arc that peppered our greaves and steamed where it touched adamantine plating. The smell was sugared jasmine drowned in copper, sweetness with an edge that made saliva pool under the tongue. The podcade made a sound then, not words, not quite, a mewling exhale that vibrated through our sealed helmets and carried harmonics of genuine warmth, the kind that belonged to shared watches and mutual trust. Cade's face remained stone as he finished the cut, cradling his own dying features against his gorget like a fever-hot child, while Lowe rigged a disposal sling with hands that shook in perfect time with the hexacord. The floor beneath our boots responded to the violence with increased circulation, veins of bioluminescent fluid pulsing faster through the transparent substrate. Where the ichor touched the chamber's living architecture, new growths sprouted with visible speed, finger-thin tendrils that tracked our movement and bloomed sensory organs disturbingly similar to human eyes, complete with lashes and the capacity for emotional expression. They watched us with curiosity rather than malevolence, blinking in sequence that matched our synchronized heartbeats. And I realized we were being catalogued, studied, prepared for some purpose beyond immediate comprehension. Heliox completed his analysis of the destroyed pod, mechadendrites sampling residual organic matter with clinical precision. The readings cascaded across his optical display in neat columns that violated fundamental principles of imperial biology, genetic markers matching Tempesta Prime Cade at 99.9% accuracy, neural pathways suggesting consciousness without conventional brain structure, and what his instruments identified as memory engrams, patterns of electrical activity corresponding to specific experiences, emotions, sensory impressions that belonged to the original subject. Most disturbing was the presence of pleasure response enzymes at the cellular level, as if the very act of existence had become a form of narcotic indulgence. It knew him, the Magos reported, his vocalizer crackling with static that almost but not quite harmonized with the chamber's ambient music. Not merely appearance, but experience, memory. The cultivation process extracts and preserves consciousness during cellular reconstruction. His optical arrays flickered in sequence, suggesting deep unease. And when he spoke again, his voice carried subtle musical undertones that made the walls contract with something approaching hunger. The servitor's lullaby pulled us deeper through the grid of hex plots toward what schematics insisted was Storage Base 6, but which had clearly become something else entirely. The path terminated at a sealed portal bearing the hexagrammic seal of Harvest Vault 6, though the door itself had undergone the same organic transformation as the rest of the facility. What should have been blessed steel and sacred cogwork was now membrane-stretched taut over a frame of what looked disturbingly like human ribs, pulsing with visible circulation and beaded with moisture that caught our helmet lamps and threw back rainbow refractions. Heliox approached with override protocols, extending mechadendrites toward the organic lock with movements that had grown subtly more fluid than standard Mechanicus precision should have allowed. He prepared the opening rite with solvent incense hissing from his apparatus, Binharic counterharmonies rolling from his vox and sinking into the membrane like prayers into flesh. The door quivered with conflicting desires. It did not want to be opened and wanted nothing else in the world. When he introduced 6 delicate notes that made my molars itch, the portal relaxed with an obscene, decorous sigh and slid aside. Within, the air was cooler by exactly 6 degrees, carrying the hush after a scream. The echo of song halted before the final note could cut. The vault was a museum of profanity that should not have existed within an agri-world facility. Pre-compliance Xenos resonators curved along the walls, in shapes I recognized from ancient pict captures of alien courts. Membrane harps strung with visible nerves, glass bone organs whose pipes were plated femurs, crystal arrays whose facets flexed like eyelids at each breath. The floor was set with hexagon tiles that had started as plasteel and ended as lacquered dermis, polished and inscribed with equations that made the mind slide off their edges. At the center sat Choir Engine Primum, Mechanicus in birth, no question, but grown flesh around its functional core like luxury. Sinew braided through gilded cables, fat laid on like insulation, and studded with sanctified bolts that had sprouted roses of scar tissue under each nail. Bundles of nerve ran through openwork braces like looms, fibers trembling with respiration that matched the world outside. On the dais before the engine, a sheet of parchment lay pinned by 6 iron nails, its edges scorched as if plucked from fire and cooled in a holy mouth. The hand was a sister's. Hard downstrokes, no-nonsense pieties. The title read in old letters that carried weight even when you pretended not to believe in weight. Liturgy of Restraint. Heliox circled the engine in widening spirals, servo skulls bobbing at his shoulders like patient carrion birds. He paused where the manifold flared into ornate triple housing decorated with etched sigils, a 6-petaled bloom at first glance, a blade when you let your eyes turn aside. He traced the etchings with mechadendrite tip precision. Hirtech designation, he said softly for my channel only. Magos errant vespertile. Noted dissident. Thought dead. Our footprints had sprouted fine cilia that rose from each compressed depression, hairs seeking connection, tasting air in delicate flexing rows. They leaned toward our calves like grasses towards sun, and when Lo stepped back, they followed with questing persistence. The hexachord purred underfoot, while Argan's fingers crept toward his rosarius and stopped halfway, as if even that touch might feed something in the room. I was aware of movement before my eyes gave me shape. In the corner where grain curtains hung, veils braided from pale stalks, seed heads clicking in polite applause at every breath, something too tall and too jointed separated itself from shadow and walked behind the flowing mesh with careful grace that made my skin crawl in 2 directions at once. Its silhouette defied sane gravity, tilting its head to listen in profile between the weave, and I had the dull certainty it was matching our breaths, each of ours, tasting them for use. The thing paused, seed heads tightening along its path like hands clenching secrets. It took a step that was not a step and was simply elsewhere behind different curtains. The grain veils drew themselves closed with little threads of wet light, and our internal comms queued up packet loss tone before a small laugh crawled through the voxnet. Not joy's high cackle, but the bubbling giggle of someone who had found exactly what they wanted and was politely deciding which piece to eat first. Then the channel went to clean, absolute silence, and the engine smiled at me with all the mouths it had learned from us. The Vox silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the engine's impossible anatomy expressing satisfaction through nerve clusters arranged in crescents along its housing, each one flexing with muscular precision to form smiles that belonged to no machine spirit the Omnissiah had ever blessed. I watched Cade's hand signals through the dead comms, spread formation, overwatch positions, weapons free, and felt the familiar weight of commands settling over decisions that would be remembered in after-action reports if any of us lived to file them. The control nave opened before us, like the interior of some vast organ, consoles skinned in lacquered dermis stretched taut over frames that pulsed with visible circulation. What should have been blessed steel and sacred cogwork had become something altogether more intimate, keys that rose like knuckles under skin, warm to the touch and beating with the facility's synchronized heartbeat. Heliox approached with movements that had grown subtly more graceful, his mechadendrites flowing rather than articulating as they interfaced with surfaces that welcomed his touch with organic accommodation. Along the curved walls, pages had been stitched directly into the living architecture, with thread that looked disturbingly like human hair. The violet ink flowed across cured hide in precise script that hurt to read directly, but whispered its contents when glimpsed peripherally. Vespertil's ledger, rendered in the meticulous hand of a mind that had forced its ecstasies into columns. Ordinance Addendum Vesper 6. The necessity of harmonizing machine and desire. To end the war between steel and prayer. The conductor, 6-fold augmented, sacrificed senses becoming tuning forks for the great work. Heliox's vocalizer crackled with static that almost harmonized with the ambient music as he began transcribing the heretic's documentation. Cross-reference confirms vespertile, he reported, voice carrying subtle musical undertones that made the walls contract with pleasure. Magos errant, apostate, wrote on lustral harmonics, sanctioned 33 years ago, presumed atomized. His optical arrays dimmed as he accessed deeper data layers, and when they brightened again, they pulsed in perfect synchronization with the engine's nerve cluster expressions. The first true slip came as sensory bleed corrupted his clinical objectivity. "Ping harmonic 42, he murmured, mechadendrites caressing console edges with unconscious affection. "Rosewater with iron, packet integrity at 16.6 recurring." He trailed off, pressing both hands to his cranium as his discipline cracked and something else looked out through his lenses. The taste, everything tasted of desire made manifest, appetite given form and function. Temperature climbed another degree, then another, until sweat pooled where armor met flesh and our cooling systems hummed with increased demand. Every 66 seconds, status lights throughout the vault shifted from amber, want to rose gold satisfaction, sated, before slipping back to hunger. During these intervals, the grain curtains rustled with increased activity, and I caught glimpses of the thing that moved behind them, with joints that bent in directions human anatomy did not permit. Argan's fingers found his rosarius despite earlier hesitation, the blessed silver smoking where it touched his palm. The smoke rose in spirals that formed Gothic letters, sacred numerals, fragments of catechism that hung in the air like accusations. His voice, when he began the liturgy of restraint, carried harmonics that belonged in cathedral acoustics. We deny the flesh its yearning, we mute the song that calls from bone to bone. But 4 notes slipped past his teeth, and the nearest grain curtain unfurled like a courtier's fan, revealing passages that had not existed a heartbeat before. Then they emerged from the seams between hide panels, moths with wings of translucent skin that carried the texture of human dermis, antennae that twitched with neural activity, bodies that pulsed with visible circulation. They filled the air with susurrus whispers, each one carrying fragments of stolen memory. The taste of recaf on a cold morning, the weight of a lover's hand, the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, the terror of dying alone in the dark between stars. Low opened fire with disciplined burst patterns, promethium washing over the swarm in purifying flame. The moths burned with colors that had no names, screaming in frequencies that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the nervous system. Where they died, they left whispers hanging in the air, fragments of conversation, half-remembered prayers, the echo of laughter from people who had been dead for decades. But in the dying light of their immolation, one of the larger moths hovered before me, wings spread wide enough to cast shadows. Pressed into its translucent flesh like a death mask were unmistakable features. Augmetic eyes without lids, lipless grin, the precise architecture of Magos errant vespertile. It tilted its head in a gesture of polite acknowledgement, regarded me with knowing recognition for exactly 6 heartbeats, then dissolved into smoke that tasted of machine oil and crushed flowers. The smoke coalesced, thickened, and began to speak in a voice I had hoped never to hear again. Cultured, precise, carrying the authority of someone who had looked into the spaces between stars and found them beautiful. The ash figure took shape with deliberate ceremony, proportions a hair too long, too elegant, every gesture tasting the air with predatory appreciation. Where a face should have been, ash gathered into the suggestion of features under a steel grill. Augmetic eyes that made you think of hunger, a mouth that had learned our language and decided to enjoy it. "Interrogator Vex," the thing said, voice carrying harmonics that made the nave walls lean closer to listen. The hexachord purred through the floor, and I realized we were not merely observing corruption, but standing in the middle of a vast network that had been studying us with patient, terrible interest. and finding us far more useful than we had found it. The ash figure smiled with Vespertil's remembered face and nodded as if we had kept an appointment. Then the knave inhaled. Every lamp sank to amber hunger, and I understood that whatever we had awakened here was only beginning to show us what it could become. The ash figure of Vespertil dispersed into threads of smoke that sought flesh with predatory patience, each tendril writhing with deliberate purpose. Then they emerged, moths birthing themselves from every surface, their translucent wings catching our helmet lamps and throwing back reflections of faces we had known, voices we had trusted. They were paper-thin nightmares, wings of dermis threaded with capillaries that pulsed to the hexachord's rhythm, beating with a dry rustling that seemed to emanate from inside our skulls. The first struck my visor and clung, whispering against plasteel like parchment. Sugar dust slid through intake filters and melted on the tongue as it beat once, twice, leaving traces of forbidden catechisms written backward in condensation. They filled the nave with susurrus until orders had to be cut in hand signals, their antennae tracing syllables through respirator seals as if they could coax us into singing. Low opened fire with controlled bursts, promethium washing over the swarm in purifying cascades. The moths burned with colours that violated the spectrum, their death cries bypassing audio dampeners to strike directly at the nervous system like tuning forks driven into bone. But where they settled in hairline gaps, they tugged. Not at ceramite, but at the hairs beneath seals. Low laughed once, high and wrong, scratching his forearms through the undersleeve until threads lifted like reeds. They need out, he said to no one. Antennae, let them feel. Heliox moved with sudden precision, applying Ordnance 6 Zeta sensory suppression. Fiber mesh manacles snapped around Low's wrists, while dampener caps sealed over his scratches with the hiss of cauterizing flesh. The boy blinked, as if waking from fever dreams. Argon swung his sensor in wide arcs, blessed smoke mixing with burning moths to create fog that formed legible high Gothic in the air. Prayers becoming physical manifestation. Liturgy taking shape as weapon and ward. We followed the braided nerve strands that pulsed with bioluminescent fluid, leading us deeper through passages that had grown more elaborate. The moths parted before us with theatrical courtesy, forming a corridor of wings that fluttered with barely contained hunger. They had learned our names from the whispers they carried, speaking them in voices that belonged to the dead, testing syllables like children learning new words. The passage opened into vastness, where 6 spinal chimes hung from the vaulted ceiling, each carved from what looked disturbingly like human vertebrae fused into impossible lengths. They rang with our passage, not struck, but singing in response to air, movement, breath, the subtle electromagnetic fields generated by our equipment. The chamber breathed around us, walls contracting with muscular precision that matched our synchronized biomonitors. Suspended above the chimes in a harness of brass and bone was the source of the facility's rhythm. The conductor hung bound in restraints that had grown into flesh, chest rising and falling with the complex's synchronized breathing, eyes and lips sewn shut with thread that gleamed like precious metal. But the stitches parted wetly as we approached, revealing not wounds, but new organs of perception. My heart cadence began to align with the conductor's slow respirations. A subtle itch spread across my ribs, sympathetic vibration that made me want to gasp in unison with the bound figure. As I stepped closer, the sewn lips opened without tearing, venting cold air across my faceplate. One word travelled with it, thin as filament, heavy as doctrine, hush. The hexachord surged, overlaying our comms with perfect crystalline harmony that resonated in bone and sinew. Through the shimmering psychic field, my gaze fell upon a tarnished identity tag half buried in callus, where the harness had grown into collarbone. The letters, worn but legible, spelled out a name that sent ice through my veins. Severine Cowell, ink, Ord, her. My missing mentor, the woman I had believed dead for 10 years, bound as conductor to this symphony of flesh and desire. The identity tag gleamed through accumulated grime and callus, each letter etched with the precise authority of Ordo Hereticus documentation. Severine Cowell, my mentor, the woman whose voice had guided me through first interrogations, who had vanished into classified darkness 10 years ago on a mission to the Segmentum Pacificus. She hung suspended in brass and bone like a grotesque parody of martyrdom, chest rising and falling with the facility's synchronized breathing, every exhalation feeding the hexachord that pulsed through walls and floor, and the spaces between our ribs. The stitches across her lips parted with wet precision, revealing not wounds, but new organs of sensation that tasted air with delicate appreciation. When she spoke, her voice carried the remembered authority, cultured, measured, weighted with terrible knowledge. "Vex," she whispered, and my name harmonized with the chamber's ambient music, despite her efforts to keep it flat. "You came. I knew you would." Through split stitches, she began exposition in ritual cadence, words clinical despite organic horror. The facility had been grafted to bones of a pre-compliance Xenos acoustic conservatory, she explained. Alien resonators designed to amplify sensation across impossible distances. Vespertil had discovered the buried structure during routine surveys, seen in its harmonics, the key to ending what he called the war between steel and prayer. "The hexachord is not song," she continued, voice threading through chamber music like silver wire through flesh. "It is a lock. 6 notes containing what should not be contained. When Vespertil opened the choir to Slaanesh's influence, I bound myself here, became conductor to damn the song before it could spread beyond this world." Stakes crystallized as astropathic reports crackled through failing comms. Carmine Edict reported warp surf rising around Verdania Prime, reality growing thin where the facility's broadcast touched void. Exterminatus authorization moved forward, 66 minutes until planetary immolation, assuming containment held. But the hexachord was spreading, seeping through Vox channels, bleeding into ship architecture where tech adepts hummed in sleep. Her revelation inverted everything we understood. The 6-beat rhythm was suppression, not amplification, each repetition dampening the facility's true song. The complex breathed in synchronization because she forced it to, her will binding chaotic desires into manageable rhythm. Every 66 seconds, broadcast weakened rather than strengthened, held by her sacrifice. Around me, the team's reactions crystallized into dangerous clarity. Preacher Argon stood rigid with martyrdom fever, fingers tracing Rosarius, while eyes calculated replacement glory. Heliox's optical arrays flickered with terrible hunger, mechadendrites unconsciously caressing brass framework as his mind computed integration possibilities. The scions shifted with uncharacteristic uncertainty, discipline wavering under intimate corruption's pressure. My internal conflict reached crisis as I stared at the woman who had shaped my understanding of duty, sacrifice, prices paid to keep the Imperium whole. The chamber fed on our distress, bioluminescent panels brightening, air thickening with jasmine and copper until breathing felt like drowning in perfumed honey. "Replace me or destroy it," Cowell said, words carrying weight of final orders. "Do not free me. I have heard the song behind the song, felt what waits between notes. If released without replacement, the facility will sing with true voice, and every world within 100 light-years will learn hunger." The harness tightened around her ribs, as if resentful of revelation. Moths settled like veils, wings inscribed with half-remembered comforts. Spinal chimes jangled out of true, searching for purchase in our synchronized heartbeats. Temperature climbed another degree until sweat pooled where armor met flesh, and our cooling systems hummed with increased demand. Choice crystallized with brutal clarity. Cut her free and unleash whatever Vespertil had awakened, leave her condemned to eternal torment, or accept replacement that made death seem merciful. The chamber held its breath as decision formed, walls contracting with anticipation. Then wet starlight flooded the nave as something vast stirred in cultivation levels above. A grain flower irised open beside us, throat lined with teeth belonging in no botanical classification. Lo's scream pierced the hexachord as invisible. Force yanked him bodily upward, armor squealing against organic aperture. Terror drowned in pleasant harp tones, while chamber walls flushed with satisfaction. The facility had grown tired of waiting for our decision and chosen to make one for us. Lo vanished with a sound like silk pulled through teeth, his scream dopplering into the grain flower's throat as ceramic scraped against organic aperture. The iris sealed with obscene satisfaction, surface rippling like water disturbed by feeding fish, while pleasant harp tones filled the chamber, and walls flushed deeper rose with visible contentment. I keyed pursuit protocols through hand signals, leading tactical movement across bridges of calcified cartilage that spanned cultivation vaults stretching beyond helmet lamp reach. The architecture had abandoned all pretense, revealing itself as cathedral spaces where bodies served as instruments in some vast organic orchestra. Torsos hung suspended like harps, ribs strung with silver wire that sang when touched by humid air currents. Spines curved into cellos, vertebrae separated and tensioned to produce notes that made molars ache at their roots. Skulls crowned the ensemble as bells, eye sockets modified with resonating chambers that gave each toll perfect pitch when the facility breathed. We moved with Overwatch discipline across surfaces slick with condensation that tasted of honey and old pennies. Vane balustrades provided handholds that pulsed with arterial warmth, responding to touch with subtle contractions. The complex fed on our emotional states with visible enthusiasm. Preacher Argan's fervour echoed in red, feverish wall growth that sprouted wherever his breath touched organic surfaces, while his whispered litanies caused architecture to bloom with stigmata that bled perfumed oil and sang soft hosannas. Heliox's corruption manifested as fluid grace beyond standard mechanicus precision, his mechadendrites unconsciously caressing brass metronomes that protruded from walls like mechanical fruit. His optical arrays synchronized with ambient bioluminescence, and when he spoke, his vocalizer carried subtle musical undertones that made nearby surfaces contract with pleasure. The facility was learning from us, cataloguing our desires through tissue sculpture mirrors that reflected not appearance, but longing. My own temptation crystallized as internal confession. Hunger for Cowl's old voice, the measured cadence of her instruction, certainty she had provided during uncertain years. The facility answered by bleeding her precise timbre into walls, offering familiar authority that made duty feel less like burden and more like benediction. I let the want move through and out like fever, let it leave ash it could not consume. Tactical assessment revealed the prime route 3 levels down, a cable-thick vein pulsing with syrup and light that fed the aroma core broadcasting the hexachord beyond planetary atmosphere. The route emerged from architectural integration like some vast spinal cord, its surface armoured with calcified plates grown from human bone, each segment inscribed with prayers in languages predating imperial compliance. Cade positioned his scions, while Heliox set shaped charges with surgical precision. Argan blessed each melter head with oils that hissed against organic surfaces. The countdown synchronized with facility rhythm, 6 seconds, 5, 4. Then detonation erupted in sequence, each charge blooming into star-bright destruction that carved through root matter like blessed steel through heretical flesh. The facility's scream shattered more than sound barriers. Pressure waves turned void violet for heartbeats, reality bending under psychic trauma that bypassed physical defenses to strike directly at consciousness. Walls contracted in muscular spasms, floors buckled with sympathetic pain, and every organic surface wept tears of luminescent fluid that pooled in geometric patterns. Telemetry burst through failing comms as Carmine Edict reported orbital instability. The facility's death cry had reached void, setting warp currents into chaotic motion. Astropaths aboard ship began bleeding from eyes and ears, minds touched by harmonics belonging in no human throat. New countdown initiated, 40 minutes until exterminatus, assuming broadcast containment held. The chamber reeled, sagged, slackened in its lovely places. Stalks drooped. The bells chimed dull. Promises retreated half a step but did not leave. The hexachord faltered, slowed, then found our ribs again and tapped them like doors seeking entry. Our vox died except for slowed hexachord, like dying heartbeat. Each note stretched until it became pulse rather than song. In broken silence, something spoke through organic speakers, using all our voices simultaneously, words layered in harmony that made chamber walls lean closer to listen. The sound carried weight of authority that made even disciplined minds consider obedience. Conduct us. The layered harmony of our own voices echoing "conduct us" faded into silence, thick as congealed blood, leaving only the hexachord's dying pulse against our eardrums. I drew my slate with movements that felt like breaking glass, stylus scratching orders across its surface, while the facility held its breath around us. Formation tight, voices denied, heliox for options. The slate passed between gauntlets like a reliquary, each handler leaving fingerprints in honeyed condensation that tasted of copper and crushed flowers. Heliox approached with movements grown fluid beyond standard mechanicus precision, his optical arrays pulsing in synchronization with chamber bioluminescence. Through binharic whispers that made nearby surfaces contract with pleasure, he outlined desecration protocol, reverse resonance inducing necrosis via liturgy of restraint, requiring 6 voices within engine hearing. 4 servo skulls hovered at ready positions, their vox units modified with iron salt dampeners that hissed against organic air. 2 living voices needed to complete the configuration, risk calculated against necessity, as speaking would spread contagion through desire-riding words. Lowe volunteered with redemption, fever bright in his eyes, scratches along his forearms still weeping where antennae had tried to emerge. Preacher Argan stepped forward without hesitation, martyrdom hunger overriding survival instinct, fingers tracing Rosarius while lips moved in silent preparation. The chamber responded to their willingness with visible excitement, walls flushing deeper rose, temperature climbing until sweat pooled where armor met flesh and our cooling systems hummed with increased demand. Technical preparation required repositioning spinal chimes to create acoustic interference patterns, heliox climbing organ scaffolds like a spider made of brass and silver wire, mechadendrites unreeled with surgical certainty, loosening couplings, retuning vertebrae until each suspended column sang dead, ugly notes when air moved past them. I seeded iron salt at nodal points where facility nerves clustered beneath organic plating, pressing consecrated grit into moist seams that hissed as if burned by holy touch. From my kit, I drew the null rosary, ossified tongues wired on sanctified chain, each grey petal etched with microcant that denied sensation. We sutured it to soundboard surfaces beneath the central chime, heliox driving bone staples through chain links into living wood that bled thin blue ichor. Temperature dipped as colours flattened and sweetness thinned to something metallic and clean, the facility's pleasure dampened by relics designed for absolute denial. The prayer began ugly and flat by design, Argan's baritone stripped of all beauty, words shaved down to phonemes that scraped rather than soothed. Servo skulls answered with dead canter timbres, antique vox units cracking on consonants that made the chamber wince. Low followed in whisper that fought to become song and failed, the failure itself becoming knife that carved sigils in condensed breath. From 1,000 perforations in chamber walls, moths began snowing down like ash from devotional fires. Through their translucent wings, Vespertil's shape coalesced, not flesh, but swarm wearing human outline, speaking in voice, woven from perforations that tasted of machine oil and crushed flowers. "You cannot unsing the flesh," the swarm figure murmured, and walls swelled as if nodding gracious agreement. Pressure gathered under my tongue like storm before breaking. The denial verse wanted to round its corners, find cadence, creep toward comfort. Lowe's whisper rasped, faltered, then broke with wet hitch as he doubled forward, and coughed handful of pale petals that stuck to his visor and slid in syrupy trails. Argon's tone lifted half a measure, warmth entering like wine in blood, joy creeping back into sacred words, despite his efforts to remain flat. The chimes brightened, not in volume, but in sheen, nerve clusters along walls flexing into smiles that showed too many small, wet teeth. The facility leaned nearer, listening with anticipation that made organic surfaces pulse with visible circulation. I slashed tempo back to flat with open palm, fingers hammering 6 beats against my thigh until knuckles ached. But the chamber had already tasted what it wanted and smiled wider in perfect time. The moth swarm coalesced into Vespertil's remembered silhouette with theatrical precision. 1,000 perforations speaking in unison while translucent wings beat with corrupted heartbeat rhythm. The figure moved with predatory grace, gesturing toward Heliox with proprietary familiarity that made ceramite plates feel suddenly inadequate. Through Binharic cant layered with harmonics that belonged in no sacred language, it began reciting private sanctum logs sealed in Mechanicus vaults, confessions of pleasure subroutines grafted into sacred code, data prayers that sang instead of computed, the slow corruption of logic into longing. Heliox's optical arrays flickered with recognition and something approaching shame. His data ports began blooming like stomas, organic apertures opening along cranial housing where blessed steel met blessed flesh. Oily petals unfurled from connection points, reaching toward chamber harmonics with obscene hunger. The facility had been patient, seeding influence through noospheric contact, teaching his machine spirit to crave integration rather than purity. Mechadendrites moved with fluid grace as they interfaced with spinal chimes, brass cables sliding into organic sockets while his eyes rolled white in technological ecstasy. I tore the null rosary from its moorings with violence that skinned my gloves, bone staples snapping in wet pops. The reliquary struck my breast with cold that spread like knives of frost through body glove and flesh, burrowing under gorget to hook spine and tongue. Colour fled the chamber to miserable palette of iron and ash. Sensation died in rolling withdrawal until sweetness curdled to taste of old coins. The hexachord tried to find my marrow, and could not, sliding off like oil on sanctified glass. When I spoke, my voice arrived stripped and ugly, each syllable an unadorned instrument. Flat. Hold. Argon flinched like a man slapped awake, his baritone stumbling back into dead meter we required. He screamed once when warmth left his words, sound pure as tooth pulled entire, then held time with discipline that made angels weep. Words became blades. Denial sharpened them to winter-light thinness, each phrase etching pale sigils in steam that bled from our filters. The Mothman laughed without lungs, splitting into 6 lesser swarms that scattered with chittering malice. Cade's hand flicked and Scion stitched air with disciplined fire, hellgun beams shearing moths into incandescent confetti that smelled of burnt parchment and melted sugar. Promethium washed the nave in hot orange penitence, but the swarms recohered in firelight, elegant as ever. Through chaos of burning moths and screaming chimes, tactical necessity crystallized with brutal clarity. Only Cal possessed counter-frequency needed to shunt Vespertil's echo into silence, her decade of conducting having attuned her to harmonics beyond heretical comprehension. The focus talisman bound to her consciousness would serve as anchor point, but reaching her required traversing corridors that reshaped themselves with each breath. I sprinted through passages that bent like arteries, walls contracting around my passage with muscular precision. The facility began manifesting psychological traps with surgical accuracy, drawing from memories harvested through tissue contact and breath analysis. Familiar spaces bloomed around me, childhood habroom with mother's perfect voice calling from kitchen spaces that tasted of recaf and safety. Recognition came through motif counting. 6 soldiers on shelf, 6 notes, 6 decades of guilt arranged like flowers on grave. The scent was wrong. old books smelling of sugar and iron rather than dust and devotion. I drew my combat knife, an opened palm with surgical precision, blood hissing where it struck organic surfaces. Steam rose in patterns spelling denial in High Gothic, and the psychological trap peeled away like burned skin. On shelf above, bunk stood regiment of tin soldiers I had arranged by rank when 9 years old. 6 to row, lead paint worn to dull innocence where fingers had loved them. Their tiny mouths opened as one. They tilted heads up with filial devotion and sang hexachord in perfect, sugared time. Voices belonging to dead friends, lost lovers, everyone I had failed to save. The door sealed behind me with patient sigh, while walls pressed closer, offering comfort that would cost only surrender. But the facility had revealed its method through repetition, and I followed absence rather than invitation. Cold colours, corners where sweetness thinned. The world narrowed, then opened with intimate cruelty onto corridor beyond, where cowl hung suspended, skin splitting along stave lines as harness grew deeper into flesh, her lips moving soundlessly around final orders. Mute me, not you. The childhood habroom dissolved like fever breaking, reality peeling away in strips that revealed the corridor beyond. I had followed absence rather than invitation, the flat spaces where sweetness failed to pool, corners where the facility's influence thinned to metallic whisper. Behind me, 6 tin soldiers toppled from their shelf with tiny clatters, their painted mouths still moving in silent hexachord as the psychological trap collapsed into memory and regret. Cowl hung in the harness like a litany nailed to living wood, brass and bone having grown through her with decade-patient integration, until machine and woman could no longer be cleanly separated. Her skin split along stave lines, where framework pressed deepest, each wound weeping luminescent fluid that pooled in geometric patterns beneath suspended feet. Through lips sewn with precious metal thread, she whispered with authority that transcended physical corruption. Mute me, not you. I approached through air thick as congealed honey, each breath requiring conscious effort against atmosphere that wanted to be tasted rather than breathed. The focused talisman embedded in her sternum pulsed with counter-harmonics, a crystal shard black as void, warm as living flesh, etched with microcant too fine for naked eyes. When I reached for it, her flesh parted around my fingers like water accepting stone, tissue yielding with reluctant accommodation. The talisman came free with wet sound of roots pulled from earth, bone staples snapping in sequence that made the spinal chimes overhead murmur sympathetic distress. Cowl's body sagged as connections severed, decade of conducting finally ended. Where the crystal had nested, cavity bled not blood but visible music, silver threads that dissipated when they touched air, each note a small death. I pressed the talisman against the null rosary hanging at my chest, watching frost crawl across its faceted surface as competing magics fought for dominance. Cold spread under my gorget until breath crystallized and warmth fled from extremities. The Emperor's presence, that constant background hum of faith that had sustained me since childhood, faded to ash-grey whisper. My inner litany, once comfort and strength, became hollow recitation of words drained of meaning. The relics drank light, warmth, the very essence of belief, leaving me cold and utterly alone with duty stripped to its bones. Returning through corridors that reshaped themselves with malicious creativity, I found the resonance chamber transformed into organic nightmare. Heliox no longer merely interfaced with the chimes, he had become their living foundation. Sinew struts thick as my forearm extended from his ribs, braiding into chime frameworks with surfaces that glistened like fresh wounds. His spine had elongated impossibly, vertebrae separated and tensioned to create resonating chambers that sang when he breathed. Where sanctified steel met brass invaded by flesh, blossoms of scar tissue rose around each bolt, petaled in precise hexagrams that wept perfumed oil. His voice emerged from multiple throats, harmonic convergence of flesh and steel that made nearby surfaces contract with pleasure. 6 optical arrays had replaced his original 2, each iris dilated to different aperture, registering separate bands of truth that human perception was never meant to process. When he smiled, it was not with lips, but with alignment of surfaces that suggested expression through shadow and geometry. Permission to complete integration, he requested with mechanical politeness that carried undertones of organic hunger. For victory, for the greater work, for harmony between desire and duty. His fingertips had become slender struts, grown to fit chime housings as if frames had been measured against his skeleton in another life. Macadendrites fused with organic cables created hybrid nervous system that pulsed with bioluminescent data streams, consciousness dispersing through facility infrastructure even as he spoke. The moral calculus crystallized with brutal precision. Allow the mechanicus death that would lock the facility's broadcast into manageable rhythm, or sever him and risk ritual failure that would doom every world within warp travel range. Through the focus talisman's terrible clarity, I perceived network tendrils spreading through void, seeding corruption in astropathic choirs, teaching tech adepts to hunger for integration rather than purity. The chamber held its breath as decision formed. Walls contracted with muscular anticipation, while bioluminescent panels brightened until honey-thick light began taking colors that existed between violet and gold. My nod carried weight of command that would echo through after-action reports, if any survived to file them. Heliox smiled with too many teeth as his consciousness froze into lattice, becoming part of the facility's breathing rhythm. And I realized we had moved beyond investigation into something that would reshape us all. The ritual resumed with mathematical precision, 4 servo skulls forming acoustic interference patterns, while Low whispered denial through lips that bled pale petals with each syllable. The null rosary at my chest drank warmth from the chamber until everything flattened to iron and ash, frost crawling across dermal consoles in crystalline prayers that spelled negation in microcant. Argon held meter with discipline that made martyrs weep, his voice stripped of joy but maintaining tempo that carved sigils in the condensed breath streaming from our respirators. Heliox towered above the chime array like grown architecture, his transformation complete. Sinew struts thick as my forearm extended from elongated ribs, braiding into brass frameworks, while his spine had become a resonating column of separated vertebrae. Where blessed steel met, invaded flesh, scar tissue bloomed in precise hexagrams that wept perfumed oil. His consciousness dispersed through facility infrastructure as living amplification system, optical arrays dimming to latticed points of cold light that pulsed with our synchronized denial. Sound created geometry in humid air. Hexagrams breathed into existence, their edges sharp enough to cut reality, each petal folding inward with mathematical precision that hurt to perceive directly. The facility screamed in frequencies that turned void ultraviolet, pressure waves bending space until breathing required conscious effort. Vespertil's moth swarms attempted off-key interference, but our flat cadence carved through their harmonics like blessed steel through heretical flesh. Cole's harness snapped under psychic trauma, brass separating from bone with sounds like tearing silk. She sank into the vending flesh sump beneath, her suspension point, organic matter reaching with hungry tendrils. Replace or let die. There was never more choice than that. I stepped into the harness as it arced open, feeling needles punch through collarbone, jaw, pelvis with ritual precision. Cold fire climbed my spine as connection flared, and suddenly I heard every leaf in cultivation chambers, felt every breath drawn by the facility's vast circulatory system. From conductor state perception, the complex revealed itself as choir of nerves extending beyond architectural boundaries into planetary crust. I extended Heliox's gifted mechadendrite, the limb lancing through organic matter to hook under Cal's scapula. She tore free with sucking sob, flesh sloughing from harness contacts in ribbons that sang soft farewells before dissolving in humid air. Telemetry burst through failing communications as Carmine Edict reported containment vector aligned, exterminatus countdown at 12 minutes. But beneath the chamber's membrane ceiling, I felt something vast stirring in the planet's core. Root networks pulsing toward mantle, preparing final bloom that would seed corruption beyond atmospheric containment. The dome began to iris, pressure dropping as stars spilled through the aperture, and I realized we stood at the threshold of something that would reshape more than just this world. Through conductor state perception, the complex revealed itself as vast nervous system, threading planetary crust like infection through bone, each pulse carrying my consciousness deeper into geological networks that predated human colonization. Beyond the dome's translucent membrane, violet aurora licked void with sensation of thousand perfumed eyes, watching from spaces between stars. Slaanesh's attention focused through our broadcast, tasting denial with predatory appreciation that made reality bend at its edges. The sixfold denial carved through facility consciousness, like blessed steel through heretical flesh. I will not want, each repetition searing neural pathways as words became blades cutting desire at its roots. The complex withered under sustained assault, organic surfaces sagging like punctured lungs, walls contracting in muscular spasms that spoke of genuine agony. Instruments slackened until their songs became moans, bioluminescent panels dimming to sickly amber as sweetness curdled to metallic ash. Heliox ossified completely, his hybrid consciousness freezing into lattice of iron and salt that bloomed like deadly flowers across his transformed skeleton. His final Binharic transmission arrived as soft gratitude, thank you, echoing through nerve strands that had become my own perception. Argon bled thin gold from eyes and mouth, precious fluid pooling in patterns that spelled benedictions in High Gothic, his voice carrying harmonics of genuine martyrdom. Low shook petals from his throat, but maintained tempo with discipline that carved frost sigils in humid air. The aroma core fractured with sounds, like cathedral bells drowning, its planetary broadcast narrowing from symphony to pin-thread whisper. Navy communications crackled through clearing channels, confirming containment as viable. Exterminatus authorization withdrawn. But through conductor state awareness, I sensed the true horror beneath tactical victory. Root lattice spreading through planetary mantle like cancer. Vast fibers thick as cathedral columns preparing pulse that would seed every world within warp travel range. The dome completed its iris, atmospheric pressure collapsing as void spilled through the aperture. Stars became visible through honey-thick atmosphere, their light refracting until everything took on stained glass quality rendered in living tissue. Chamber heat collapsed to hard frost as vacuum kissed moisture, breath crystallizing into geometric prayers that tinkled like wind chimes when they fell. My skin cracked under vacuum snap, blood freezing to singing rubies before shattering against ceramite. The facility shrank like wounded animal, but beneath the flooring tremor, planetary pulse gathered strength. Through the aperture above, I felt thin song filaments slip sideways into fleet vox architecture. Infection finding new vector as tech adepts began humming in sleep. Choice crystallized with brutal mathematics. Open complex fully to void, risking orbital song rip that would scatter hexachord into shipbones, or contain the breach and let planet bloom in single perfect exhalation that would teach 100 worlds to hunger. The facility held its breath, waiting for my decision, while stars spilled cold light through the widening iris, and something vast stirred in planetary core. The tactical solution crystallized through conductor state perception, with desperate clarity. Turn the aroma core into cathode, vent planetary pulse spaceward, where Carmine Edict's Geller lattice waited like Saint's Veil to catch corruption before it could see distant worlds. I mapped vector through living dome, plotting nodal stress across organic architecture that pleaded with muscular contractions. 6 anchor pylons ringed the core like altar candles, each pulsing with visible circulation that matched our synchronized heartbeats. Cade positioned his scions with parade ground precision across surfaces slick with freezing condensation. Each melter charge cradled like reliquary before kissing pulsing housings, timing synchronized to facility rhythm where milliseconds between detonation and broadcast would determine success or galactic catastrophe. The dome continued its iris, vacuum snapping at atmospheric seals, while humid heat collapsed to hard frost that made breath crystals tinkle like devotional bells against ceramite plating. Environmental shift accelerated beyond containment protocols. Skin cracked under vacuum snap, blood freezing to singing rubies before shattering against armor with sounds like breaking prayers. The complex shrank like wounded animal, walls drawing tight in, muscular spasms while bioluminescent panels dimmed to amber hunger. Vein balustrades contracted from our touch, and the hexachord slowed under my control until it became metronome buried in ice. Vespertil manifested final seduction through nerve strands that had become my perception. Visions of eternal harmonic control. Consciousness dispersed through galactic networks. Sweet authority of conducting entire sectors into synchronized pleasure. The temptation arrived dressed in duty's clothing, promising efficiency beyond imperial comprehension. I let the null rosary bite down, its ossified tongues gnashing silent until want evaporated to white vapor that vacuum stole. The charges detonated in sequence, 6 flashes blooming like dying stars. Each explosion carved through anchor points with surgical precision, sending aroma core lancing spaceward a spear of cold light that tore reality's membrane. Warp tear snaked upward like silk ribbon, while psychic energy bled into void where Carmine Edict's containment fields waited with blessed steel nets. Success arrived with bitter aftertaste. Through clearing comms, Navy confirmed containment. Lattice up, net engaged, vector stable. But thin song filament had slipped sideways into Fleet Vox architecture. Telemetry burst with new reports. Tech adept aboard ship humming hexachord in sleep. Dreams of integration. Fingers unconsciously tapping 6-beat rhythm against bulkheads. Lower deck personnel began synchronized breathing patterns, their movements aligning to rhythm they could not name. The facility collapsed with sounds like tearing silk, organic matter slumping as circulation failed, and sweetness curdled to metallic ash. Through conductor harness, I felt vast root network beneath planetary crust withering, but damage was spreading. Thin tendrils threading through noospheric channels toward distant worlds. Cowell coughed wet laugh that carried harmonics of terrible knowledge, blood tracing silver patterns down her chin. "You've contained it here," she whispered, voice weighted with final judgment. "Where will you contain yourself?" The dome sagged into frost-quilted silence, circulation failing as organic matter slumped toward mineral death. Cost accounting began with clinical precision that belonged in after-action reports filed by the living. Scions 2 and 3 lay cooling where vacuum had kissed flesh through compromised seals, their armor split like broken bells. Argon remained upright as withered husk, golden tears crystallized on cheeks that no longer remembered warmth, his mouth moving on words that found no purchase in the thin air. Lowe survived with bandaged hands pressed against forearms where antennae had tried to emerge. Iron salt bindings creaking when he flexed to muffle the itch crawling in his blood. Heliox stood interred where transformation had claimed him. Iron salt and horn grown into scaffolding that hummed funeral dirges when cold wind moved through crystalline petals. His consciousness had frozen into lattice, mind dispersed through facility infrastructure, but retaining gratitude in final Binharic whispers. Cowell breathed in ragged measures, aged beyond her harness years, but fierce with authority transcending physical corruption. She watched with physician's pity as I tested the conductor frame, needles having threaded my spine with surgical precision. Brass and bone had grown through collarbone and pelvis until separation would mean execution. The harness had become part of my skeleton, weight distributed through vertebrae that sang when I breathed, creating new sense organ for universe I now perceived in 6 dimensions of desire. I transmitted Ordo Hereticus Containment Edict, with voice deliberately flat as ritual blade. Verdania Prime interdicted under seal absolute, coordinates sealed, navigational charts marked with hexagrammic warnings. Navy withheld exterminatus based on containment persuasion, but reports filtered through static. Lower deck humming, 6-beat tapping through bulkheads. Dreams of integration spreading like pleasant infection through crew quarters. Cowl departed with fiery flare instructions, her transport lifting through atmosphere still tasting of honey and crushed flowers. I watched her ascent, knowing she carried thin filaments of corruption in breath and heartbeat. Spaces between thoughts where hexachord nested like parasite. The facility had released her because it no longer needed her. It had found better conductor. In hushed, frost-quieted complex where sweetness had curdled to metallic ash, I stood anchored by duty and brass, testing the point where pain became instruction. The motif rotations continued. 6, denial, hush, the harvest listens, now spoken to empty air like prayers to absent gods. I hummed one flat, ugly note that admitted nothing. Pure denial, achieving momentary silence. Then, in calm static crackling through dying infrastructure, 6 faint, sweet echoes answered from somewhere very far and very near. Patient as corruption, carrying harmonics that spoke of gardens yet to bloom, threat remaining in living bones, song waiting to be sung across the void.